What is up, everyone? Welcome back into Shout. I feel like I'm seeing an old friend, and it's weird because I just saw you, 3 days ago? It's not like we've been apart very long, 4 days ago, but I feel like we haven't been in these seats in our own studios doing a podcast in like 2 or 3 weeks, maybe even longer than that, before Disney, because we had the Combine, we had a couple weeks where I had a couple different guests on. How are you, my friend?
I am doing great. We've got an active chat tonight. It's popping in here. A lot of NFL news flying, so I can't wait to get into it, Matt.
S Clem over on YouTube is asking, does the YouTube channel show my insider text line status? For some reason, I feel like my accounts aren't linked. Either way, this is Sean, the Vegas boy from the Roundtable. What is up, Sean? They're not linked. Go to joinsubtext.com/shoutbuffalobills, and I believe you can access your account from there. And speaking of which, everybody become a Shout Insider. Get that 2-week free trial right now. With free agency next week, there's no better time. I am going to be sending out, as I'm sure Ryan will be, my top targets in free agency over the course of the next 4 or 5 days. We're going to be dropping a mock draft on Friday is my plan, my post-combine mock draft. That'll go to the insiders first in the text line. So definitely get locked in there. What else is going on?
Well, I guess we can start with some NFL news there, Mr. Parrino, and probably the headline of our show tonight. Mr. DK Metcalf requesting a trade. At the NFL Combine, there was a lot of talk and speculation about Metcalf. There was kind of like a beat reporter, like source off at that point about teams that were interested in him. The Packers had an offer on the table, and the Bills were lurking, and so were the Chiefs, maybe. And then
Who were the insiders?
Who
were the insiders?
2 of them were Locked On Packers guys, and or maybe the Seahawks beat, but either way, yeah, the 2 of them were from like the Locked On, and then the other was just like longtime beat reporters saying Metcalf's not going anywhere. He's a big part, and they may, the people that said Metcalf's not going anywhere, that may be what the coaching staff wants there, but now Metcalf has certainly made it known that he wants out and he wants to join a contender.
So I've been kind of lukewarm on this idea for a while, and then something really struck me, because what's been the big emphasis since the Super Bowl and since the Bills were eliminated? The defensive side of the ball for Buffalo, right? Figuring out a way to take a big swing on the defensive line, whatever that looks like. Kevin says he hates clickbait titles like this. It's not clickbait. We're going to talk about this. I have a take here, and that is the headline of the show. I'm not trying to clickbait you, Kevin. Just come in, hang out, pull up a chair. We appreciate you, love and shout, man. We really appreciate you. So here's what I got to thinking. Philadelphia Eagles, they go out and they trade for A.J. Brown in 2022. And what do they do over the next 2 seasons? They go to the Super Bowl, 2 of those 3 seasons. And I think one of the big things that A.J. Brown did for Jalen Hurts was at all times when he is on the field, it gives you somebody that the defenses have to game plan for. In the prime of his career. I mean, they got him a little bit earlier on. I mean, A.J. Brown and DK Metcalf were in the same draft. They both slid into the second round. And I'm looking at this Bills offense, and I really wouldn't be against them running it back with the similar everybody eats model, the hope that Dalton Kincaid takes a step. You have James Cook potentially in a contract year if they don't make something happen before then. I like all those things, and I'm fine with it, especially if they really retool the defense. But the more I've sat here and thought about, we talked about a Chris Olave trade over the weekend. To me, DK Metcalf is the kind of big-time swing that Brandon Beane can take that I think changes the math for this offense and potentially all the other players, pass catchers, wide receivers, tight ends, running backs. And I think that you put DK Metcalf on one side, you put Keon Coleman on the other side. You put Khalil Shakir in the slot, Dalton Kincaid at tight end, Dawson Knox, however you want to figure that out, and James Cook. You now have what really is one of the elite offenses in the NFL. And go look at DK Metcalf's stats, Ryan. Year in and year out, the guy is, he gets banged up from time to time. I've had him in fantasy football. He appears on the ticker with injuries every now and then, but he's played 15 games or more every season he's been in the NFL. He had 2 10-plus touchdown seasons. You'd be adding the kind of playmaker at this time in his career. He'll be 27 next year.
Yeah.
I mean, you are buying in on the prime years of DK Metcalf's career. I think it takes a lot of pressure off of Keon Coleman. It gives you that bona fide number one outside. And now here's the other part of it. If you're Joe Brady, you can get creative with how you use Keon Coleman. I know Khalil Shakir is going to play in the slot, but he doesn't play 100% of the snaps. I think you can morph Keon Coleman into a little bit of a hybrid player that allows you to play him on the outside, but also allows you to play him at the slot in that big slot role where some people think he might have a little bit more success. I like the idea. The more I think about it, it cost a third and a first to get A.J. Brown all those years ago. I think you probably can get away with a second and a future fifth to get DK Metcalf, potentially, depending on what the market looks like. Under those parameters, are you in?
Under those parameters, I am in. Now, I will say this, though. When you trade for a receiver of Metcalf's caliber, the trade compensation is probably not going to be the bad part because the team trading him away knows that he's going to want a new deal. And that's part of the reason that you trade him off and you get what you can for him. Then the Bills, though, have to pay a lot of money to DK Metcalf. And you can argue that he's worth every penny. Every season since joining this league, he's never had fewer than 900 yards receiving in a year. He's had some good quarterback play in his time in Seattle. He's had some questionable quarterback play. Not a knock on Geno Smith. Smith had some huge games in Seattle the last few years where he's thrown for well over 300 yards, and Metcalf's been a part of that. But there's also been some games where he's off the mark and he's not targeting Metcalf in the big moments. And when you have a guy of that size, that type of physical specimen, you'd like to see him have some more consistent stats. Where 992 this past season, over 1,000 3 of the 4 years before that. It's probably worth it in my book for a lot of the reasons you mentioned. It's a true number one outside receiver. It's what they were looking for last year in the draft class. Is a big reason why they probably went with Keon Coleman. It unlocks Keon Coleman a little bit more. There were a lot of draft analysts that said if you're going to take this guy, he's probably going to be best as a big slot. That doesn't mean he can't play on the outside, but like you said, Khalil Shakir won't play 100% of the snaps in the slot, so you can use Keon Coleman there. You still have that speed factor with Curtis Samuel right now on this roster. You have some tight ends here that you really like. I still think they bring back a guy like Matt Collins on a team affordable deal, and you have James Cook, Ray Davis, and then possibly bring back a guy like Ty Johnson. It makes matchup nightmares for opposing teams. Metcalf, though, keeping him in check a little bit. He's someone that can get a little emotional on the sidelines. We've seen that in years past with Stephon Diggs. It's not saying that they are one and the same. It's not saying that he's ever, done anything or said anything about his quarterbacks or anything like that. But he is an emotional guy. That's something that the Bills would have to factor in. But in a very weak draft class at wide receiver, this would, for the Bills, would make a ton of sense. We can talk about the fact that a lot of fans are saying, no, you got to go defense. Myles Garrett's the dream, but we still don't know when, or if the Browns are going to be shopping him this year, if they're going to wait until the trade deadline, if they're going to, just bury their heels in the sand, so to speak, and try to keep him there against his will. As much as it'd be great to add a premier pass rusher like that via trade, there's no guarantee it's going to happen. So if you can add a playmaker on either side of the ball, which Metcalf would obviously be for offense, I'd be all for it at this point in time because it answers a lot of what you were trying to do last year with that Keon Coleman pick.
So yeah, sure. You asked me the question of Myles Garrett or DK Metcalf if you can only pick one. I think both of us are probably going to go on the Garrett side because I think that's the kind of game-changing move in a conference where you're facing elite quarterbacks to get to the Super Bowl. It makes a lot of sense to go out and do that deal. But to your point, we're sitting here in March, and one of the big things I've talked about all week, I've done a couple of radio hits, is like, it doesn't seem like there's any end in sight to this standoff between Garrett and the Browns. This is something that could kind of leak into next season. And I talked about it multiple times on this podcast, to me, the post June 1st cut of Von Miller, to me, I do that if I'm Brandon Beane, if I'm eyeing a trade for one of these kinds of players. Now, Max Crosby is no longer in the cards, right? Because he ends up signing a 3-year extension today, making him the highest paid defensive player in the NFL. Kudos to him. It's probably something he was angling for all offseason. From what I've read and heard, he likes Las Vegas. Why wouldn't you like living in Las Vegas? And, they got Pete Carroll there. There's probably something to believe in there. But I think you could free up so much money with a post June 1st cut of Von Miller. Then you can kind of take your time and try to figure out a way to acquire a Myles Garrett or maybe somebody we're not even thinking about. I think a Trey Hendrickson deal would probably happen sometime before June 1st, maybe somewhere around the NFL draft. But I like that idea. But I don't think it has to be one or the other either, Ryan. Like if you sold me an offseason that included a trade for DK Metcalf and Myles Garrett, that's the kind of offseason that Howie Roseman would try to have if he was trying to get to the Super Bowl after losing in the NFC title game. And I think that's one that Brandon Beane has to seriously consider. He's taken big swings in the past, Roseman. The trade for Brown and giving him 4 for $100. Going out the next offseason and getting Hassan Reddick, or maybe it was the same offseason when he went out and got a huge big-time pass rusher, whatever that was, paid top dollar for it. I think there's a way to do both of those things, still keep the majority of your draft capital. And here's the other thing. Defensively, the positions that are important, cornerback, defensive end, defensive tackle, they're deep in this class. You're not going to be, out of the fun if you don't get it in the first or second round. Those are positions that you can kind of attack on day 2 and day 3.
Yeah, very, very deep draft class. Maybe not the same size as some of the big boys that fans would want, but Joshua Farmer is a day 2 pick. They're just raving about the Bills. Love to play next to Ed Oliver. He would be available with one of those round 2 picks, possibly even fall into round 3. I know the Bills would have to, either move down with one of their second round picks, whatever the case may be, to pick them in that range. But there's a ton of guys in this draft class in terms of the defensive tackle position specifically that the Bills could target and upgrade at that area. So you're right. And they could still go first round with that if they were trading for a Metcalf, and the hypothetical that you pose with the second round pick and then a day 3 pick. I see Roy in here mentioning you can't access the money from Von Miller until after June 1st. That's very true. But there's restructures the Bills can do. There's extensions that they can make. We're seeing across the league how quickly money can get freed up by releases, restructures like what, CeeDee Lamb and Dak Prescott, I think today had one as well. Teams can free up money a lot easier than it seems. It's not that the cap is not real, because it very much is so. But when it comes to having to have the cap space available for a player like Metcalf or Myles Garrett, hypothetically, the Bills will just have to pull a few levers and they would be able to do so.
All right, so let's get into, thank you for watching Shout on this Wednesday, March 5th. We are exactly 1 week away from the start of free agency officially. We're obviously 5 days away from the start of the legal tampering period. We'll have you covered, Syracuse.com on the Shout podcast, so make sure you keep it locked in. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel as well. Hit that little bell there on the episode or on the page, and every time we go live or we set up a live, you will get a notification for that. All right, 2 wide receiver names that are set to hit the market that we can kind of dive into a little bit as a side conversation to Metcalf. Metcalf feels like the big swing. Sure. These 2 would be significant swings. Like, I don't want to downplay them too much. Both of them at different stages in their career. Seattle's Tyler Lockett, who will be 34 next season. That's something to consider. And then the Jacksonville Jaguars are expected to cut Christian Kirk, who you made a great point of, is very close friends with Josh Allen. So let's talk about which one do you like better, and how much do you think that should be a factor, will be a factor, Kirk's relationship with Allen?
So first, I wouldn't call them big swings, because I would say that would be like a bunt single for a Lockett because of the age factor. But
wow.
if you're asking which one I like better, though, it's actually Lockett. Because
he'll be 33, excuse me, I'm sorry.
And where you can play him a little bit more versatility there, a little bit more flexibility. The Kirk makes a lot of sense from the Josh Allen relationship, and we've seen them go to that well before, bringing in teammates of his, close friends of his. A lot of the time it's been at the quarterback position, but let's never forget the Tanner Gentry era of the Bills, where they brought him in, the Wyoming friend of his, and some other close friends along the way. He was just, let go of today. He's primarily a slot player, though. That's my biggest issue with Christian Kirk. I believe it was something around 74% of the snaps. Maybe it was higher. This year we're in the slot when he was healthy
84,
and played.
84 this year.
Thank you. 84 this year. So that's what worries me. Yes, there's some, experience of him playing on the outside. There's some injury concerns there. Certainly more upside to his game in terms of age. I still think that you can get a few good seasons out of him, but you just paid Khalil Shakir. You just extended him to be your primary slot player. So there is a little bit of, repetition there in terms of we already have a guy that can do a lot of what Christian Kirk does.
Right. That to me is the first thing I think of with Kirk is just the redundancy. Now, if you go back to early in his career in Arizona in a different offense with a different play caller, he played a significant amount in 2020 out on the boundary. So it's not something that he can't do. And you know that he has that kind of versatility, which if you're Joe Brady and the price is right, maybe you like that idea of throwing him in. The problem is they have too many flavors of that kind already on offense. You mentioned Khalil Shakir. Curtis Samuel kind of falls into that bucket in his own right. You could probably make the argument that you should kind of look at Dalton Kincaid in that way as well. But Kirk is interesting. He's younger. Now, Lockett. This is an interesting one because 3 years ago, I love this idea for the Bills because I think he was at a different place in his career. I mean, he's coming off of a season where he played all 17 games. He had 74 targets, 49 receptions, 600 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So obviously not as productive as he had been. I mean, he was on a streak of 4 straight seasons with 1,000 yards or more from 2019 to 2022. He was one of the best, least talked about receivers in the NFL. And I think that a lot of that comes with playing with DK Metcalf. They go out and they draft Jackson Smith and Jigba. They're expected to kind of hand the reins over to him a little bit in this offense, especially if they move on from DK Metcalf. But Lockett is to me, it would be like a Leonard Floyd edition, right? Like maybe somebody that you go into free agency and you have this name checked off as potential targets. And then you end up with Leonard Floyd and you're like, at first it's like, I don't know. And then it ends up being a really meaningful addition.
And you look at the free agent draft class the free agent class that's out there. And, you're looking for certain attributes. And unfortunately, the premier players aren't there. So some of those lesser names, the guys that maybe you thought would have a niche role, they might be getting more money out there in free agency than what you were expecting. Where a guy like Lockett released today, yes, he's a free agent too, but the compensatory pick formula the Bills always think about, that might make him more appealing. He's going to be cheaper because of his age, his stat production last year. If you're looking for a 1 to 2 year option to help with another, I wouldn't even use the word weapon, but another flavor for this offense, you can do a lot worse than Lockett. I think his stat production last year went down a little bit because they were getting Smith and Jigba more involved in the offense. You have Metcalf. They obviously were a balanced team. They weren't just a pass-heavy team. Geno Smith had his ups and downs. So I don't think that Lockett just fell off a cliff last year or saw a major drop in his production just because of his age. There was a lot of other factors to it. But in terms of, the cost might be easier to bring in a Lockett versus even a Christian Kirk, who released it. I still think he could get decent money out there. And then some of these free agents, like a Darius Slayton, that at one point I thought might be a good fit for what they're looking for. I think he's going to have a bigger market than people are expecting when you look at the free agent class out there. You have to weigh everything and the cap situation. If the Bills really do want to go heavy on defense in terms of the draft and even addressing it a little bit in free agency with spending more money on defense than anything else, a cheaper option at receiver is going to be needed. And maybe Lockett is that. maybe he's one of those tier 2, tier 3 guys that sit on the market a little bit, and you have an idea of what the market is, where then you can bring him in and on an agreeable deal.
You look at the separation numbers for these two Seattle receivers last year, Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf really kind of fell into the area of the graph that, doesn't really blow you away. I mean, they're in the same sector as Keon Coleman, Deebo Samuel, some of the other wide receivers. I mean, Shakir's in there too, obviously a little bit different. He's more of a zone beater than a man beater. But some of the names that you look into the elite category in that top part of the graph, guys like Josh Palmer, who's a free agent, of course. My last year's draft crush, Brian Thomas Jr., right there with Jamar Chase and A.J. Brown and Nico Collins and Amon-Ra St. Brown in the same kind of little circle Malik neighbors. Garrett Wilson's also in there. And, before I get to Garrett Wilson, because I don't think that even if the Jets decide to trade him, which I don't think that they would, I don't think they'd trade him to the Bills. But one more point on DK Metcalf. Yeah, exactly. One more point on DK Metcalf. I don't think you could take those separation numbers and put him in that box as if that's all he's going to be. There's a complete difference in terms of the run game for the Bills, the complete offense that he'd be in with the Bills, and the potential for him to get one-on-one coverage when you have to worry about all these other pieces and the Bills' ability to run the ball. Now, I do think they had a pretty good run game there in Seattle with Charbonnet and who's the starter there? He's really good. I think Kenneth.
Yeah, Kenneth Walker III.
Yes. So they had skill players there. I think that maybe last year's separation numbers aren't indicative of Metcalf's ability to not only get open in the short area, but explode through guys.
Yeah, 100% can explode through guys, still has that burst downfield, fits the criteria of what they look for in terms of the blocking. Imagine him blocking downfield on James Cook runs or Ray Davis runs. He's a guy that one can move, but two, the physicality that he brings makes a ton of sense if you can acquire him for the right price. The original talks that media were speculating about was like a first-round pick and a receiver from Green Bay. I don't expect him to get a first-round pick. I agree with you. It would be a few picks, with one of them being on day 2, maybe 2 day 2 picks, but you have to weigh everything in addition to the price of the draft capital, the money you're going to have to pay him. He does fit what the Bills need very, very well. So that's what makes him so appealing. The X receiver, the size, the willingness to be a blocker, him catching passes from Josh Allen is something that I'm sure that a lot of fans have already imagined since he's made this trade request. And it just feels like one of those pairings that would go extremely well.
Breaking up a little bit, that Olean internet is flopping here on a Wednesday night. We're hitting a little bit of a tough
storm here, though. Good
rainstorm. That might be it.
Yeah,
that might be it. Thank you for checking us out on a Wednesday night. It is almost 8:00. We're 20 minutes in. We're going to go about 40 minutes here today, and then we'll come back with another pod. When I drop my mock draft, we'll dive into that a little bit, whether it be Friday or Saturday or Sunday. We'll figure out a day to do that. Where do you want to go next?
I did. You already kind of touched upon Max Crosby, but with him agreeing to that extension today, it does shut the door a little bit on the Bills in terms of, who could you go to with the standoff lingering. I don't want to spoil your, I know you're doing a mock draft this week, but in terms of what we were going to do with the Tex Insiders, is there a pass rusher that you're looking at right now in free agency that you wouldn't mind bringing in here? Someone that you would not have to acquire via trade.
So I think we could have the Khalil Mack conversation quickly. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well. For me, it's kind of two-pronged. Number one, I think it would be a fun story, right? As somebody that went to the University of Buffalo, to cover him kind of maybe the twilight of his career, coming back to the city where he put, the university on the map when he was in college, would be a fun story. I think he still has juice left. My hesitancy, if I'm Brandon Beane, on signing up for probably what would be a 2-year close to fully guaranteed contract, it's probably what he's looking for wherever he signs, is you pay the money, you're probably going to get the production, you're probably going to get the same player, but there's a track record here of maybe not so great track record of failing to get the most out of guys initially when you add them into this system. So does Khalil Mack walk in day one? Now, Von Miller is a good example of where it did work. It worked from the very start. I think he ended up having like 8 or 9 sacks in 8 or 9 games before the injury. It was looking like it was trending towards a home run kind of signing and move. But man, I'm worried about the price tag. I'm worried about what has been a difficult time for the Bills to find consistent play at that spot. And it's a little bit of a roll of the dice because of the age.
100% a roll of the dice. And I still think the production is there. I still think he could be a factor for this team. Another UB product that I wouldn't mind kicking the tires on, Malcolm Kuntz. He has a knee injury had a knee injury last year, but he was showing some real promise as a pass rusher. Fits from the size perspective about 250. Bills like those edge rushers 250, 260 range, as we've seen over the years. I wonder if you could kind of get him on a team-friendly deal. But this is a big fall off from conversations on Myles Garrett, and when we thought maybe Max Crosby would be available, and Trey Hendrickson, these guys that are, I can't say guaranteed double-digit sack producers, but as close to that as you can come. So it's a huge drop-off, but the Bills may have to weigh some options in free agency. There are some guys here with the Buffalo ties, UB ties, that are going to hit the market. So he is an intriguing one, an under-the-radar player. Maybe a 1-year prove-it type deal to try to reestablish his value. Maybe coming back to an area that he's familiar with would be appealing to him as well.
There's not a lot of, as you go scroll down this list, guys that you see and you're like, you get super excited about. Dante Fowler is one that I think we talked about a couple years ago. He's kind of bounced around to a couple of different teams. He's somebody that will turn 31 years old. So whatever ends up happening, it's probably a 1-year deal for Fowler wherever he ends up. And you look at his last couple of seasons. He played last year in Washington, played in all 17 games the last 3 seasons. The sack production last year was really good. I mean, he's probably going to command somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 to $15 million per season. He had 10.5 sacks last year for the Commanders. That could be an idea if you're not willing to go to the threshold of what it's going to cost to get a Khalil Mack. And I agree. I kind of like your idea on Malcolm Kuntz as a guy that has a lot to prove coming off of an injury. But this is a guy in Fowler who's kind of been like a mercenary of sorts over the last couple of years, signing a bunch of really short-term contracts. According to SpotTrack.com, his valuation in their system, even after the 10.5 sacks last year, 3 years, $15 million, $5 million a year, a season. Is that something you sign up for? Do you have concerns at all about the style of player, kind of an undersized, outside kind of guy? I mean, Corey makes a good point in the comments here, probably a little bit like Leonard Floyd stylistically from a couple seasons ago.
But Floyd had a really nice season when all was said and done. I know come playoff time, he disappeared a little bit, but he did produce for Buffalo. So I think the Bills, as we're seeing now, they're not going to necessarily sit there and say we have to add someone at this, this frame in terms of height and weight. They do have a type of style of player that has fit over the years, but we're seeing some willingness to adapt with some of the coaching hires that they've made. Some of them, the moves late in the season, big influx in man versus zone. So little things like that show me that they're willing to adapt come player style as well. So, a player like Fowler or Fowler himself, I'm not ruling it out. I'm not ruling out a Hassan Reddick, a revenge season for him after everything the Jets put him through. Josh Sweat, I've seen in the comments, he makes a lot of sense. I think he's going to have a big market, though, so that's what worries me there. The age, the upside, the production that you think you can get out of him. So it's going to be tough. It's just one door closed today with Max Crosby. One door is still locked when it comes to what's going on in Cleveland with Myles Garrett. So it's really tough trying to figure out who they could get to improve their pass rush. So there's options available. We've named a few of them. It'll be interesting to see if the Bills do dive into the pass rush class in free agency, because that might tell you a lot about Myles Garrett and the Browns really not being willing to move him at all.
We kind of covered a bunch of receivers here, but the one guy that we didn't talk about, and a great comment in here by Alex Barber, I think responding to the title of this video when we positioned a potential move for DK Metcalf, he asked simply, wouldn't it be simpler to just sign Devante Adams, who the Jets released a couple days ago? And listen, if he's prioritizing playing with a great quarterback, this may be somewhere where he wants to land, but obviously a lot of the juice early has been on the Chargers. Can go play with Justin Herbert, go back to the West Coast. He's looking at probably a 2-year, $30 million contract, somewhere in that range. What are your thoughts on Adams? I do think that would be kind of a nice consolation prize if they were able to add him. I think he showed down the stretch of the season he still has something left that he can offer. But I also think that there's a bit of a sideshow act going on there as well. If you watched Hard Knocks with the Raiders a couple years ago, no, it was the show Receiver. I think we've talked about this before.
Mm-hmm.
I just came away from that show with just like, if you watch that, I don't know if you're all in on the idea of Adams in your locker room. He showed up, he went to play, but just the way that he handled losing, and you figure he's not going to do a lot of that if he comes and joins Josh Allen in Buffalo. But I don't know. They're just a couple of red flags after watching that show.
And I would be happy to be wrong, but I agree with what you said. I think he wants to be out on the West Coast. I think he wants to be a team along the lines of the Chargers, and there's appeal there in terms of his role in that offense, the quarterback, the flashes that they showed this year. I know that their playoff, how things went in the playoffs did not bode well for them, but he's a player that they probably feel could put them not over the top in terms of being a Super Bowl team, but get them closer to maybe being a Super Bowl contender or a Super Bowl team. I just don't see Buffalo being a high-ranking spot on his list of destinations to go. If I'm wrong about that and he shows interest, then by all means, the Bills should consider pursuing him. I do think there is a lot left in the tank in terms of the talent-wise. And I feel like most number one receivers, they do have that ego. They do have that chip on their shoulder, the emotional side of things. It's part of the game. And I can't say every, because there are the Jamar Chases of the world where I can't remember any situation where he's kind of flown off the handle on the sidelines or anything like that. But a lot of them, it comes with the territory. So I don't mind bringing along a little bit of baggage or attitude if it makes your team better. And I do feel like Adams would make this roster better. I just don't know if he would seriously consider Buffalo.
So Spin, one of our regulars in the comments on YouTube, he brings up a good question about Darius Slayton. And here's his question. If you can get Darius Slayton for under 13, his market value right now is 15. And because of this receiver group, he's going to get paid. I would take it, he says, for the Bills, even though he probably is only worth 8 to 10, but as one of the top wide receivers in free agency, you're going to have to overpay a little bit to get him. He's somebody that I flagged very early in the process at the right price. I think you get excited about. The more we've kind of gone along here, though, I think instead of that endeavor, save the money for the defensive side of the ball and go out and try to find a wide receiver that fits what you'd want Darius Slayton to be in your offense and take a couple swings at it. Like with 10 draft picks coming up in this draft, you can draft 2 different wide receivers that maybe have similar kind of responsibilities in your offense, whether it be a boundary X, a Z, however you want to kind of parse that up, and then set him out the training camp and say, compete for the job. I mean, that's what they did with Kyer Elam and Christian Benford, and they landed on what is now a borderline all-pro player at the position, and somebody that's become so good that the first-round pick from 2022 is very much on everybody's cut list going into this offseason. So I think this draft is really important. There's a bunch of really interesting day 2 and day 3 targets. The one guy that's really caught my eye after talking to Chris Trapasso at the combine last week was Jack Besh. kind of some similarities to like the Puka Nakuas of the world and some of these other kind of upstart receivers. There's a couple of those kinds of guys in this draft and some speed flavors too. If you want to kind of find a guy that's really reliable and can, really good as a route runner, and then maybe find somebody with some speed that you can kind of send out to training camp and see where you land.
Sure. And Darius Slayton specifically, I was looking up a quote. I was reading an article on him today. I'm not shutting the door on him being an option for the Bills. I think there's going to be teams throwing some big money out at him, $15 or more million per season. But he said something in his interview, and I'm going to say I'm going to take it with a grain of salt for now, because I've heard a lot of athletes say they prioritize winning and then they go off and they sign a huge deal with a team like the Raiders or the Browns or what, teams that are not contenders, and they ultimately settle for money. He was doing this podcast. Let me get the name of the podcast. So I give him the Talking Ball with Pat Leonard podcast via the New York Daily News. And he talked about, he goes, the one thing I've learned in my career is you play with guys that have the attitude of, if I go off and I get paid, I sleep great at night. And I've learned over my career that I do want to go off and I do want to get paid. But it weighs on me so heavy just losing every single week. I can't take it. Like, there's no money that's going to make me go home and be like, I'm obviously going to be a little more happy in my Hellcat than my Camry. But in my spirit, the core of me cannot take that. So winning is important to him. Now, could he go to a situation where it's a team that's a playoff contender and get paid a lot of money and not lose as much as he had recently with the Giants? Absolutely. But if he is serious about, being on a team where he's not losing every single week, that's what it gives me a slight chance that the Bills could be in the running for his services. He would have to take a little bit less to make it work, but he says right there, yeah, he wants to get paid, but he just can't keep losing the way he has been as of late.
That's going to be what you kind of play at with his agents. And depending on what he kind of goes out there and gives as the marching orders, the problem though is in this crop, and there's a couple of things. So did you read Matthew Berry's column that came out of the combine
about Dalton
Kincaid? But more so I thought was the comment from somebody in the Bills, I think, that said that Amari Cooper might be cooked.
Yes.
Did you see that part of it?
It was in the same, yeah.
So that kind of changes the math a little bit on maybe the pursuit of Cooper as a free agent option. And so now if you can have a conversation with Slayton and you land at a deal that puts him somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 million per season, if he wants to take a little bit less, even 11, but the numbers come in looking dramatically different. Like Joe Buscaglia of The Athletic put out the reported the numbers of the Khalil Shakir contract earlier today. And this was a $62 million total valuation contract for a 4-year extension, but the cap hits are crazy. 2025, this season it'll be 259. Next year it'll be 679. And then the real bulk of the deal doesn't start in until 2027 when it's 13.9. And then you're probably going to get in the game of restructuring and moving money down the line. So this is a deal that really at the end of the day is not coming in at $15 million a season. This is something that's much more manageable for the Bills. And maybe that's something that Slayton's willing to kind of come to the negotiating table and figure out something that makes sense for this side if he wants to join a true contender. And I think Slayton is a guy that you throw him into an offense like this, that's his first real chance to showcase what he could potentially do in this league.
And just quick side note, that 13 million in a few seasons for the cap hit, with the way the cap's going up in the NFL, just think about where that's going to rank him in terms of the wide receivers in this league. He's going to be knocked down pretty far, even if they don't restructure, or even if they do, obviously, which the Bills love to do that in terms of freeing up more cap space. That cap hit right now isn't bad in itself. There were a lot of people that thought he could get about 17.5 million on the open market if he were to hit that after next season. So a great work by Brandon Beane. And when it comes to the pursuit of a Darius Slayton, you could offer a little bit less money, maybe more guaranteed money. And then that Beane's going to structure it in a way that makes it digestible for the Bills in terms of their cap space for the next few seasons.
Another comment in here I saw a few minutes ago was kind of touting Von Miller's season last year, talking about, the pressure rate, I think was back to what you would expect for Von Miller, although that he didn't play as much. The sack production wasn't what you probably signed up for at the number that, he originally signed for. What's your final prediction on Von as we move into the final legs of this week? Nothing has been reported on, a pay reduction, which is what he did last season.
Mm-hmm.
If the Bills decide just to cut him and free up about $8 million, if they cut him with a post June 1st designation, that would open up the full $17 million. What do you think ends up happening with Von? And then after that, let's talk about what we think should happen with Von. I think those are separate things, what we think the Bills will do and what we think should happen.
So in terms of what I think will happen, I think they must be having some kind of talks right now, because you have to be, under the cap, I believe, by Wednesday of next week. And the Bills really haven't started making any big moves, restructures, anything like that. They're going to have to do a few things soon. And I know one or two restructures can get them where they need to go. But Von Miller should be high on their priority list in terms of, are we letting this guy go or are we going to restructure? So something tells me a final decision has not been made yet. I saw a few articles saying, I think it was the ESPN Insider, it's kind of like a 50-50 coin flip at this time in terms of whether or not he comes back to Buffalo. And that might be true. They might sit there and say, well, the pressure rate was up, but we cannot bring you back at this number. You'd have to agree to bring it down to whatever number. And maybe Von and his people are countering, willing to take that hit or take that reduction. But it would have to be a little bit higher. So I think negotiations are ongoing. In terms of what I would do, or do you want to hold off on that? Did you want to give your speech?
Drop it. You're cooking right now. I'm stepping aside.
I hate to just sit here and say in terms of what I would do is I would part ways with him with the June 1st designation, because you do need to have a backup plan in place. If you let him go and there's not a plan in place in terms of addressing that, you're not better off in terms of your roster and your pass rush. So they would have to say, well, then we're going after this player in free agency, or making a move for this player via trade, or we're going to get aggressive in the draft in the first round, and we're going to be willing to move up from 30 to go get a Green out, one of the better pass rushers in this draft class if he falls into the early 20s. There has to be a plan B if you're going to move on from Von Miller. But if you're asking me right now what I would do, yes, I would release him with that post June 1st designation.
DeJuan Smoot had more pressures in the AFC title game than Von Miller. That's sign enough to me at this point. It's pretty clean cut to me. I think it's time to move on. I know the Bills, being in McDermott, they rave about Von and his willingness to take the pay restructure last year. I get all of that. But there's still so many things that go into, the last couple of years, the injury, just the promises made at the start of that contract, and maybe some of the, the hurt there still from Bills fans, seeing that contract get handed out and just not seeing it yield the kind of results they were hoping for. I think it's going to end up being too much money no matter what. I'd move on and just start fresh. And I think that they have to, Ryan Nielsen coming in is a great addition. And I think he has a track record of developing young players. And so in a draft class that has real talent at the edge position, you spent a 5th round pick on Javon Solomon last year. I think it's time to really move into that youth movement and hope that you can land a big fish. And it might not be Myles Garrett. Maybe it's somebody we're not even talking about yet. But either way, I think moving on from Von Miller at this point in his career, it makes a lot of sense, because I don't even know if they're going to get the number down low enough to where it's palpable for your 4th, 5th defensive end.
Yeah, and that's just it. It would have to make sense from the team cap perspective. And you're right. Would he be willing to go down to a number that the Bills would feel comfortable with? And part of me says no. I think Von would be okay, signing a short-term deal elsewhere to wrap up his career. He's always hyped up Denver. I don't know their cap situation right now, or if they could even use a player of his caliber. I could see him happily, though, going back there or just landing with another contender for a 1-year deal. As much as he says he wants to be back, I think that both sides could probably just, move on from one another. And this was fine, in terms of he's not going to have anything bad to say about Buffalo. They brought him in hoping he'd be the difference maker. It didn't work out. Brandon Beane really took him under his wing for the post football career, how he wants to be a GM. I think that they can end on a good note and just realize it's not, it's time for them to say, hey, he might be talking about mine too. I have a massive water bottle here too.
Dude, we got the 1.5 liter boy. We're going to get this done before bed tonight. You got to stay hydrated. In the winter months, especially, you got to stay hydrated.
That's right.
It's like, can that water bottle be any bigger? Let me see yours again. Okay, he's probably talking about yours. That thing is massive. Wow.
I go through one of these a day.
Nice.
At home.
Okay.
And I drink it. Yeah.
I like it. All right, we're gonna finish up here on probably what we probably should have led the show with. The biggest moment in sports over the last week.
Whew.
And it wasn't football. And you know me, I've long since hung up my wrestling fan my badge. I don't watch wrestling nearly as much as I did when I was younger. But John Cena turning heel at Elimination Chamber. We were together on Saturday night. By the time I got home, I ended up Caitlin went to bed. So I threw it on and I'm like, we'll see what happens. And man, I'm glad that I did. That was one of the more epic moments in wrestling in decades. What did you think?
I thought it was insane. Like, I predicted that CM Punk would win that match, the Elimination Chamber, and he'd be the one that would turn heel. He said when he came back, he's coming back to win titles, not make friends. So that made sense to me. John Cena, it blows me away because this is his last year. He said, this is my last year wrestling. I'm done at the end of the year. He's going to have to turn into a good guy again before it's all said and done. Then there's, the clock's already ticking on this heel run, but it's cool because of the whole title record. He's tied with Ric Flair, 16 titles. I didn't see it coming, though. This is Mr. Make-A-Wish. No one has granted more wishes for the Make-A-Wish Foundation than John Cena. He talked about how in 2012 he was ready to turn into a bad guy, and he had done all this changes in music, had all new gear, and then they just didn't end up pulling the trigger on it then. I did not think that in 2025, 13 years after the fact, and his way out the door, that they were going to do this. So it caught me off guard, but I loved it for that reason.
I didn't really know what was happening because I think, to your point, it never felt like that would be in the cards because he's fought against it for so long. But when it did happen, like, you immediately knew the gravity of the moment because, funny story, I was huge in the Attitude Era, Rock, Austin. When Rock started making movies and when Austin kind of just faded away or left for, creative differences or whatever that was going on at that time, I really just lost interest, mainly because of the rise of John Cena. Like, I never liked the, hustle, loyalty, respect, dorky, PG vibes. Like, it just wasn't for me. I was out. I watched it during the Attitude Era. That was just like watching, I don't know, going from South Park to Sesame Street. It didn't vibe for me. So anyway, watching that moment and now what that sets up over the next month, like, I'm really pumped to watch the road to WrestleMania. I don't think I have at all. Like, I kind of got invested a little bit last year on the Cody Crybabies getting their way to WrestleMania so they can get their boy to win the title. And somebody asking in here, how can you get excited about a fake sport? I'm not really that excited. I just know Ryan's son Owen loves it. I joke about it with Maniac, and it's good. I mean, I think Triple H has done a really good job bringing it back to like a place where people are really, it's got a huge audience once again. I don't think the audience ever left, but it feels like it's more part of the national conversation. Like, it just wasn't for many years there.
And, the whole fake sport comment, I look at it as just entertainment. It's like when I go and I watch Ted Lasso or Shrinking or any of these series that I enjoy watching. It's just entertainment for, a few hours when you tune in, and when you something like that, you get a cliffhanger ending or something you're not expecting. It makes for good television, and that's exactly what the John Cena heel turn did.
All right. That'll do it for this episode. Remember, mock draft 1.0 for me, Bill's mock draft, coming out on Friday. Check that out. We'll have a podcast to go along with that. For Ryan Talbot, I'm Matt Parrino. Become an insider, 716-528-6727. Get locked in for the next week and a half as we have you covered for free agency and then beyond. Going to the owners' meetings later this month. It's going to be a busy March and then on to the draft. Take care, everybody. Have a great week.